That's not a comet. Torrin Vask didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words dropped into the room like a cold iron bar, and everyone turned toward the central array. The laser plasma display pulsed in warning, a thread of deep orange crawling across the Kuiper feed like a vein across frost-bitten skin. Davik's hands froze over his input module. Trajectory. Decelerating. Controlled vector. It's scanning, Torrin answered, already walking toward the secondary console. His boots thudded against the composite flooring. Soft, muffled, but heavy enough to echo off the bunker's steel lattice supports. The observatory hadn't felt tense in years. Years of watching wars they didn't fight, of silence woven into policy. Yet now, even the chilled, recycled air had gained a sharp edge, like dry ice caught in the throat. The hume of the filtration units, normally ignored, now buzzed against every nerve ending. Torrin's fingers danced across the heads-up controls. Data cascaded into view, sensor sweeps, radiation logs, pulse echoes. The object wasn't deflecting solar winds like natural debris. It had its own envelope. Energy envelope matches Vren scout class, said Len, the youngest analyst in the team. His voice cracked at the end. No one mentioned it. Torrin leaned closer to the screen, pupils narrowing. It's pierced the Kuiper boundary. The cloak held, but it knows something's here. Davik rubbed his face, the movement leaving a greasy smear on his temple. How long before the Directorate sees this? They're seeing it now, Torrin replied. We were never off the grid. Our feed runs cold to Command Station Helix. Seconds later, the emergency channel blinked to life. The laser plasma wall display at the far end of the room shimmered, flickered, then resolved into a grid map of the system with the Directorate's seal spinning at the bottom corner. Malor Tin's silhouette appeared in profile, his jaw clenched. One gloved hand gripping the edge of his station console. Observation command, confirm. Is it a probe? Torrin answered without hesitation. Not just a probe, it's scouting for a blind spot. Ten exhaled, short and clipped. Has it pinged our field? Torrin looked back to the display. The curve of Earth's cloaking field was holding, but barely. Fractals of static shimmered across its edges, white noise against a curtain meant to be invisible. Yes, it tested the edge 3 minutes ago, sent out a patterned pulse. We don't know if the return made it to their command net yet. Malor didn't blink. You have full tactical support. Keep it from getting confirmation. I'll convene the high table. The display blinked off. No goodbye, no protocol. Just the hollow sound of the channel ending. Len finally asked what they were all thinking. If it already sent the ping, isn't it too late? Torrin stared at the orbital path arcing closer toward Neptune. We'll know in 72 hours. Earth hadn't fought a war in over 500 years. Not since the Directive of Absence was passed, the final ruling of Earth's global government to remain invisible, inaudible, and out of sight while the galaxy tore itself apart. Torrin had grown up studying the footage. Vren spores liquefying atmospheres. Cypher burn crawlers hollowing moons from the inside. Humanity's choice had been silence. But silence only lasts until someone listens closely enough. 3 hours later, the orbital cloak flared. Not a ripple, not a flicker. It flared. Torrin stood alone in the outer corridor of the bunker, leaning against the durasteel support near the airlock. Through the thick composite glass of the viewport, space shimmered, just enough for the human eye to catch. Like a mirage against the black. Like heat above asphalt, he whispered, to no one. They're already here. Malor Tin's command room aboard Station Helix was built like a jury chamber. 8 darkened seats around a central display pit. The floor panels clicked softly under his boots as he crossed to the center, removing his gloves and placing them beside the command console. Patch and Southfield observation, I want their lead live. Thorne's face filled the central field. His features were drawn tighter than usual, as if every muscle behind them were choosing silence over expression. They're on the edge of the exosphere, Torrin said, 3 ships, 10 kilometers long, emission trails match Vren strike vessels. They're not broadcasting diplomatic channels. Only a single wide beam. Identify or be extracted. Director Haval spoke from the shadows. They know. No, Torin answered, eyes narrowing. They suspect, but they haven't seen us yet, not fully. The cloak still holds. They're blind, but sniffing. Ten folded his arms. Options. The cloak can't absorb a sustained kinetic pulse. If they hit it hard enough, it'll light us up like a flare. Our orbital defense network is idle. Our deep vault protocols have no decoys. If they fire on us and see a gap, we lose the bluff. General Merrick leaned forward, metal-tipped stylus in hand. So we fire first? They'll detect origin, said Torin, and call reinforcements. They're not alone. Silence dropped again. This wasn't theory anymore. This was a trigger moment. Torin continued, slower now. We have to assume they're testing response curves, not just looking for life. They're looking for resistance. And if we pretend we have none? Tin asked. Then they strip the planet and we die, quiet. 3 days later, Earth's skies changed. The cloaking field shuddered again, not a failure, yet, but like a muscle that had been bruised too many times. Torin's team at Southfield worked in silence. No one laughed. No one filled coffee mugs. No background music from personal consoles. They watched as the Vren ships entered high orbit, moving with mechanical elegance, stopping at equidistant positions around the planet, like executioners circling a target. On the final approach vector, one of the warships opened its lower ventral bay. Not to launch weapons, to skim. A pulsing beam, deep violet and slow as dripping oil, spread across the stratosphere. The scan wasn't aggressive, it was surgical. Vask stared at it like it was a blade hovering an inch above the skin. Davik stepped forward. They're cutting through light, not heat, not mass. They're sampling photon delay. They'll see the bending, Torin muttered. And once they do... The room fell still. Torin finally turned toward the rest of them. His tone didn't shake, but his words cut. They didn't come to talk. They came to count how many of us they can use. And on the 4th day, the Vren spoke again. This time, it wasn't a demand. It wasn't even translated. Just a single image, burned into the display of every orbital satellite. A Vren fleet over a glassed world, scorched from pole to pole. And beneath it, the signal rendered in human binary. Last chance. Contact spread across Sector Theta 6 beam intensity just spiked again. The bunker's reinforced floor trembled faintly under Davik Nor's boots as he stepped through the outer seal, cold sweat already beating beneath his collar. The lights inside flickered once, long enough for every technician in the chamber to notice. The distortion field was warping at the edge. The Vren weren't just knocking anymore, they were pressing their fingers into the veil to see what bled through. Where's the nearest deformation ripple? Torin asked without looking up. His gaze was locked on a rotating 3-dimensional model of Earth's upper orbital shell. Instead of clean vectors, the outer layer warped in clumps, as if the gravity itself was bruised. South Atlantic, just east of Recife, Len answered. They're not sweeping randomly. They're mapping our pulse deflection. Davik stepped closer, his throat dry from the recycled air's chemical sting. They're treating it like an onion, peeling it one layer at a time. Then we'd better stop giving them slices. Torin turned, eyeing Davik up and down. You built the array. You built the original framework for it. Climate curves, long-term oceanic cycles. Nothing meant for this. Davik exhaled slowly, his voice low. But it responds to entangled feedback. If I can swap the buffer phase and reroute through a single modulation stack, I might be able to distort their scan returns. Torin nodded once. You've got 30 hours. More like 24 if we're lucky. We're not. Torin handed him a stack of red-coded schematics. Start in Subbasement 3. We'll divert cooling from fusion cores to give you the draw. Try not to rupture the mainframe. Davik took the files without a word and walked down the corridor, already calculating bandwidth tolerances in his head. Above them, in low orbit, the Vren warships opened their lateral spines. They didn't fire weapons, not yet. Instead, narrow streams of violet-threaded energy arced out from their sensor bays, crosshatched beams slowly scanning the cloak's contour like a blind surgeon tracing a patient's skin for weaknesses. Each pulse pulsed back data the cloak couldn't fully mask. Feedback surged through Earth's shielding nodes, draining power across half the grid. The Directorate War Room dimmed. Command tables automatically dropped into reserve mode. The primary feed cut to static, before restoring with artifacts slicing through the visual feed like torn fabric. Malor Tin watched from the central platform, his gloved fingers curling against the edge. "Status on city sectors?" he asked. "Shanghai, Johannesburg, St. Petersburg, all reporting partial blackouts. Emergency shelters are lit but running lean. Some hydro circuits failed when coolant rerouted to grid nodes," replied Colonel Hask. "They're not attacking," said Hevel, folding his arms tightly. "They're seeing how much we'll tolerate." "And we'll tolerate exactly nothing more," Malor replied coldly. "No response, no engagement. Tell cities to maintain shelter directives. Panic is worse than fire." "Panic has already begun," Hask muttered under his breath. In the city tunnels beneath Tokyo, thousands huddled behind blast-sealed doors. The temperature had dropped by 5 degrees in the last hour. Backup heaters struggled. Condensation trickled down concrete walls, catching on the backs of people's necks. A child whimpered. A man shouted to keep quiet. An argument broke out over bottled water. Then came a sound none of them were ready for. A metallic buzzing that seemed to shimmer rather than strike. Not thunder, not impact. Above them, unseen, a Vren atmospheric drone coasted through the air like a mantis riding invisible strings. Its wings clicked open, not flapping, but shifting to redirect glide. Beneath its core, a thread of blue light touched the dome of the city's highest tower, then flickered toward the old harbor. It wasn't firing, it was counting. Back at South Field, Davik's palms stung from static buildup as he rerouted the capacitor gate into the quantum field modulator. "Disconnect the third junction," he shouted to the technician across the scaffold. "If we leave it hot, it'll fry the array once we sink." The tech hesitated. "That's a primary flow. We lose cooling." "We've already lost cooling. I need flux balance, not temperature control." The man obeyed. Steam hissed as thermal seals popped and the line rerouted. A warning klaxon blared, but didn't trip shutdown. Davik grunted. "That's one done. Bring up the phase adjuster." Torin entered the room as the control rods locked in place. "How long?" "I'll make it work in 12, Davik muttered, wiping his forehead with a soaked cloth. "Any longer and the Vren won't need maps. They'll have entry points." Torin didn't blink. "They've already got drones in atmosphere." Davik froze, then nodded once, mechanically. "Then let's make sure they don't stay up long enough to report." In Buenos Aires, a drone cut silently through the clouds. Its sensory field rotated, measuring population heat signatures, underground tunneling patterns, artificial power surges. It floated over a military compound, hovered for exactly 6 seconds, then shifted direction. Its casing bore no weapons. Its mind had no room for mercy. As it passed the center plaza, several civilians in hiding broke from cover, running toward an armored checkpoint in hopes of food. The drone flicked downward. A siren blared, followed by an automated lockdown. Too late. The rush turned to collapse. One man screamed, another never got up. Not because the drone fired, because in terror, dozens crushed each other trying to escape what they couldn't understand. At Station Helix, Malor Tin's eyes scanned the list of casualties being updated in real time. No blasts, no strikes, just trampling. Asphyxiation, collapse from panic. We can't maintain silence if we're choking on it, Hevel whispered. Silence is still the strongest weapon we have, Maylor replied. We've lost 17 civilians in Buenos Aires and Tokyo. One more drone passes and we'll lose the cities themselves to riots. Then tell Torin he's out of time, Maylor said. His countermeasure launches at sundown, whether it's ready or not. Torin stood outside Southfield, staring at the night sky. One of the warships was barely visible through the shield's thinning veil, its shape like a jagged shard, motionless but suffocating. Davik's voice crackled over comms. We're synced. Field modulation will be unstable, but if the phase lines hold, they'll see whatever we want them to see. Torin tapped the earpiece once. Then make them see what we've never had. Davik hesitated. And what's that? Torin's breath hitched, a tremor of something far older than fear creeping into his voice. An army, a reinforced corridor of Southfield Zero groaned under the polar wind's pressure, as if the outside world wanted in. Frost had crept into the sealed entry mechanisms, crusting over metal like slow corrosion. Inside, the temperature held barely above freezing, not by failure, by design. Torin Vask hunched over a console, his breath visible in front of the backlit interface. Screens showed thermal anomalies and modulation stacks, but none of it mattered unless the core idea worked. To make Earth appear untouchable without ever building the fleet they would pretend to have? Davik Noor stood beside the central housing unit, sleeves rolled to the elbows, exposing arms scored with static burns from rushed recalibrations. His voice was steady, but the rapid movement of his eyes gave him away. Phase dampeners are ready. Once we route through entangled bands, their scanners won't show what's real, only what we tell them to. You're sure the cloak won't degrade with the signal layering? Torin asked. Sure, Davik scoffed, rubbing a palm down the length of his coat. It's stitched together with workarounds and borrowed timing arrays. It won't collapse, but it's going to whine. Let it scream, Torin muttered, as long as they see what we want. The hum of spinning fans filled the ceiling vents. Not clean, sterile noise, but choked with grit, kicked up from the fusion draw systems pulling heat away from the quantum stack. Beneath their boots, the floor vibrated faintly, like the belly of a sleeping creature not meant to be woken. In the far corner, 3 technicians in thermal suits worked in near silence, each movement careful, as if sudden gestures might trigger the wrong sequence. These weren't soldiers. They were men who'd studied equations meant for ocean tides, not survival. Satis on cloaking power bleed? Torin asked without turning around. Blent's voice crackled through a headset. Down 10% across polar generators. Southfield's drawing more than modeled. Malor Tin's voice broke through a secondary channel. We can't feed Southfield if it means losing grid stability. You push too far, we go dark across 6 continents. Torin didn't flinch. If we don't distort their readings, they'll stop scanning and start harvesting. Maylor's reply came slower this time. You've got one attempt. If it fails, fallback is direct engagement. There's nothing to fall back with. Malor ended the transmission. Torin exhaled through clenched teeth and turned toward Davik. We ready? Davik nodded once. 1 charge. 1 run. At low orbit, a stealth probe began its loop. Outfitted with passive lenses and a cold core relay, it drifted between Earth's shadow and sunlight like a forgotten satellite. The Vren weren't looking for it. They didn't have to. It was the only craft Earth dared launch above the field. Inside its cockpit, a 2-man crew watched readouts flicker between static and thermal noise. The pilot adjusted the trim, banking the hull gently to avoid a collision course with reflected sunlight. His partner tapped commands into a frequency isolator, waiting for the Vren's ping pattern to repeat. Then the signal vanished. The readout blinked once, then stopped altogether. Seconds passed. Recalibrate, the pilot said. I'm trying. The cockpit lights dimmed. Not a flicker, an erasure. The relay feed at Southfield showed the last frame. a distorted echo of the Vren's pulse bouncing off the probe's shell. Then, nothing. Torin looked at the timestamp. How long were they in sweep range? Less than 4 seconds, Davik answered. They saw the probe, and they didn't want us to have it back. Turin's face stayed still, but his fingers tightened over the edge of the desk. First laws. Vakit didn't respond. No one did. Night returned to Southfield. Outside, a whiteout blizzard howled across the ice caps, battering the upper structure with frozen air thick enough to crack composite. Inside, the pulse array sat primed beneath its containment vault, drawing energy slowly from fusion cells that groaned under the strain. Torin paced slowly, arms behind his back, his footsteps the only rhythm in the room. They're waiting to see if we flinch. If they believed we had strength, they'd call for reinforcements before risking a drop. They're still probing because they think we're bluffing. Davik adjusted the gain calibration. So, let's bluff better. Lights in the vault shifted from blue to crimson as the signal began charging. The quantum array wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even an offensive tool. It bent perception, rewriting the echoes Vren's scanners returned. With the right modulation, it would show shadows of a fleet that never existed. Hundreds of signatures, shaped from echoes and spectral delay. If the Vren believed it, they would stop testing. If they didn't, they would drop from orbit and begin burning. Do it, Torin said quietly. Davik activated the step. Across the upper stratosphere, the cloak flared, then bent. Like a heat shimmer on cracked pavement, the signal warped outbound. Vren sensors detected 12 heavy cruisers, then 38. Then 112 vessel-grade distortion halos locked in what appeared to be a defensive grid around Earth. One Vren observer drone, stationary above Madagascar, transmitted a rapid sequence burst of alerts to the warships. None of them fired. They adjusted orbital position. Subtle, minor, like a predator facing unexpected resistance. Earth's sky remained still, but their sky was now crowded. Back inside Southfield, Torin turned toward the observation rail, where a small monitor replayed the Vren sensor returns via passive reflection. They were seeing it. All of it. Davik sat back, jaw slack, hands still gripping the console. It worked. They see the fleet. Torin didn't nod. He didn't smile. We just lied to the most advanced military in the galaxy. Davik's grin faded. And if they call it? He asked. Torin closed the monitor. Then we build the lie again, bigger than before. Outside, the snow continued falling. Above them, the enemy watched a world bristling with warships that had never been built, guarded by ghosts that never lived, only simulated, only pulsed into illusion. But in war, perception could be armor. And for the first time in centuries, Earth wore something that looked like teeth. Commander Rylan Holt adjusted the harness across his chest as the doors sealed behind him. The launch bay smelled of coolant and polymer grit, and the stale compression of a sealed environment that had never been opened to open air. 12 men stood ready behind him. No salutes, no formal orders, just nods passed between helmets and steel visors. In the center of the bay, 6 decoy units rested inside mag cradles, each shaped like a broad-winged dreadnought hull, stripped down to framework and signal projectors. They had no engines, no weapons, only emitters and heat coils, shadows built to move but never fire. Rylan keyed his comm. Phantom units locked. Are they in position? Orbital grid is stable, came Len's voice. You'll have 30 seconds between passes before they can triangulate your drift lines. That's 20 more than I need. He turned to his squad. No lights, no pings, only drift and decoy. If they see real burns, we're already ash. No one spoke. They moved to their pods, sealed inside, and waited. In low orbit, Earth's atmosphere bent again. Not from heat, from projection. Satellites equipped with scatterfield projectors fanned out across the night hemisphere, each transmitting bursts of false data. thermal patterns, radiation bleed, simulated maneuver trails. Within minutes, the Vren warships registered hundreds of new contacts. Each appeared unique, each pulsed with reactor heat signatures and residual engine flare. From the Vren perspective, Earth had sprouted a battle fleet overnight. Inside their command vassals, segmented eyes twitched across layered sensor screens, calculating threat alignment. No transmissions, no hails, no weapon locks. Just movement, slow, orbit consistent, and strategically spread. Still no energy signature spikes, one analyst in Helix muttered. The deception's holding. Malern entered the chamber with a hard expression and a tighter timeline. Make them believe we're talking, he said. Lynn glanced up from his station. To who? To everyone. Make up command layers. Encrypt it all. Dead channels, fake pings, nonsense relay traffic. Build a fleet they can't understand. Within minutes, a fabricated command web lit up across hidden satellites. Bursts of encoded chatter mimicking fleet orders, calibration commands, docking rotations, standby overrides. None of it real, but all of it believable. Roland's pod detached from the upper cradle, drifting forward on magnetically nullified momentum. His viewport showed the second decoy veering left, heat coils painting a wide arc as the hulls shimmered against Earth's reflection. Through narrow-band passive scope, he tracked the Vren scout formation moving perpendicular, 6 units, gliding like angled daggers toward the field of shadows. He whispered into his mic. They're trying to isolate emissions. They'll come close. The reply came through static. Let them, as long as they don't get bored. The first scout broke formation, arcing closer to one of the decoy dreadnoughts. It scanned with layered pulses, too weak to pierce, but strong enough to raise hairs on anyone watching from orbit. The decoy responded with heat bursts, fake thruster data, simulated noise profiles. The scout lingered, backed off, then rotated away. It didn't fire. It didn't report visible changes in behavior. It simply floated backward, as if unsure of what it saw. Inside South Field, Torin monitored the timing of each sweep. He scribbled down drift intervals, data returns, field inconsistencies. We need to give these ghosts orders they can't track, he muttered. Right now, we're just showing motion. That won't hold if they decide to press. Davik, kneeling beside the quantum modulation core, looked up. We push too far, and the cloak starts flickering again. We don't need to push, Torin said. We need to aim them in circles, make them believe we're rotating patrols, mask the lies with more lies. He leaned over a secondary array, eyes narrowing, and find the frequency the Vren scouts are all syncing on. If they're sharing real-time data, they're all anchored to something. 6 hours later, Vren recon probe spread wider. A new wave arrived. Smaller, faster. These didn't hover. They zipped through orbital paths like wasps, stuttering scans through delay intervals. Their objective was clear: isolate false readings from anchored mass. Fake signals had a pattern. Real mass didn't shift without inertia. Inside the war room, tension snapped with every beep. They're trying to prove what's not real, Len said. And, asked Malor, they haven't fired, which means they haven't decided. Torin didn't respond. He was cross-refrenching return pings against historical frequency bands, fingers tapping so fast the haptic keys barely caught up. Then he stopped. He stood upright and pointed at the stacked relay loops. They all timestamped their returns, even the ones with angled approaches. They sync back to a core node frequency buried in their sweep delay. Davik stepped forward. You're saying they're all tied to one channel? Everything in their observation fleet feeds back to a single control spine. If we find that point, we don't jam one ship, we jam all of them. Malor Tin approached, his coat dragging faint static across the floor. If you're right, and we hit that channel, Torin met his eyes, then their entire coordination web goes blind. And if we miss, they'll know we tried, and that we're bluffing. Maylor looked down at the interface, then back to Torin. Build the breaker. In orbit, the illusion thickened. With every hour, more decoys moved into pattern. Shadows crossed each other in rhythmic sweeps. Earth's upper sky resembled a fleet on standby. No movement too aggressive, but nothing idle. The Vren warships didn't shift position. Though they didn't leave. They watched. From the ground, civilians never saw the ghosts above them. They stayed buried in shelters, listening to nothing but air filters and the weight of unslept fear. But in orbit, a story unfolded. Earth, a silent world, had become a silent fortress. And above them all, floating behind a polarized canopy, Commander Holt whispered to his crew, "They're waiting for us to blink." He leaned forward, sweat dripping down the side of his jaw, and stared into the nothing that now believed it saw everything. "We're going to make them close their eyes first." Snow slashed sideways across the reinforced dome above Southfield Zero. The ground beneath the launch scaffold groaned from the fuel line's vibration, heat exchangers leaking faint fog into the ice tunnels. Inside the command shaft, Davaknor wiped his eyes with a sleeve already streaked in graphite and coolant. He'd been working 12 hours without pause, recalibrating phase relays with hands that trembled more from fatigue than cold. Torin Vask stood nearby, watching the weapon cradle lower into the launch frame. The warhead was old, an outdated fusion core repurposed from decommissioned orbital stockpiles. Its shell was split open to make room for the new device, the quantum frequency amplifier built to rupture the Vren command thread mid-broadcast. "The housing won't hold if the frequency bloom's too wide," Davik muttered, adjusting a dial with his thumb knuckle. "We could fry every orbital sensor we own." "We're not keeping the lights on," Torin replied, eyes sharp. "We're trying to make them go blind." Behind them, the control team monitored the thermal balance across the satellite dish mounted above the ice dome. Its surface had begun cracking under the recoil stress from test runs. They'd reinforced it with composite mesh, but even that bowed slightly under pressure. "How close will the Vren be when it goes off?" one technician asked. Torin answered without turning, close enough to regret being that curious. Low orbit glinted with movement. Commander Rylan Holt's stealth wings skimmed through decoy clouds, his shuttle blending with the projected echoes of non-existent vessels. The cockpit reeked of electrostatic charge and recycled filtration gel, the air dry enough to sting the throat. He leaned forward, forehead pressed against the cold mount of his targeting scope, watching the Vren formation adjust again. "They're tightening," he said into the mic. Len's voice crackled over the secure channel. "Interceptors have shifted toward Sector 9. They're running latency tests. You've got 20 minutes before they triangulate drift paths. Then we give them something to look at." He keyed into squad comms. "Split the wing. I want overlapping shadow projection. Deploy counter-signatures and bleed radiation on loop delay. Make every decoy look like it's prepping launch." His second-in-command hesitated. "If they call the bluff?" "They won't if we make it cost them to test it." 3 craft peeled away, dropping signal bursts to draw attention. They didn't fire, they just moved. Exactly like warships preparing to defend. The tactic had worked before. It might hold one more time. Might. At Helix Command, Maylor 10 stood at the center array as global feeds filtered in. Reports of satellite lens failures, radar distortions, artificial spikes in upper atmospheric static. The cloak was holding in form, but not in function. Cracks had formed where none should be. Evil entered from the lower corridor. "We've begun partial archive withdrawals, priority files already en route to Lunar Vault 3. How long before the field collapses?" 6 hours at this rate, maybe less. The projections are dirty. They've started hitting us with cross-spectrum pulses. Are the civilians aware? Not officially. But there's movement across shelter nodes. People are feeling it. Malor's face remained still. If this fails, we don't have a second plan. Hevel gave no response. They both knew it was true. At Southfield, the final alignment began. Davik inserted the core amplifier, guided by rail clamps that clicked into place with a jolt that jarred his shoulder. Power is uneven, the tech beside him warned. Field sync is stuttering on the lower band. Davik gritted his teeth. Boost it with static load. I'll tune the spread after ignition. Torin entered the chamber as the clamps locked. Is it armed? Built and ready, frequency keyed. If this gets triggered while it's grounded, it'll rupture everything inside a 10-kilometer radius, including us. Then we don't let it. He stepped closer, watching the warhead's casing light from within, faint pulses blinking in a rhythm that wasn't natural. It wasn't a countdown. It was alignment. The time it took to hold an echo on a quantum signature long enough to tear it open. Torin turned to the room. The moment they fire, we respond with this. Not before. The cloak's weak, but the illusion still holds. We bait them, they bite, then we strike. A technician spoke from across the room. Commander Holt just lost 2 shuttles on their latest maneuver. 1 intercepted, 1 crashed during evasive burn. Torin's jaw tensed. Confirm recovery? Negative. They're gone. Davik set the wrench down harder than necessary. Then we don't have another shot. They're narrowing in. Rylan Holt floated through pitch-black space, eyes locked on the ship that had taken his men. The Vren destroyer loomed against Earth's glow, its flanks lined with communication antennae and crystalline growths that shimmered with stored data. He watched it pivot, angling closer to one of the fake dreadnought signatures, unmoved by the losses it caused. It was studying the fleet, testing the lie. He clenched the control stick. You'll see what you came for. Then he dropped 3 static mines into the drift and cut thrusters, letting the ship coast blind into the data scatter. The enemy scanned again, and this time the reflections fractured. For a moment, their feed would be noise. At Southfield, countdown began. 5 minutes until launch alignment. The cloaking field twitched like a film stretched too tight. Pockets of low-pressure current flickering across the horizon, casting momentary shadows on the earth below. Davik? Torin said, stepping toward the console. Your breaker. You trust it? Davik didn't look up. I don't trust anything this fragile, but it's what we've got. Torin placed one hand on the ignition panel. Then we stop being seen. Today. Or we get seen for what we actually are, Davik muttered, unarmed, cornered, faking it all. Torin's reply was steady. If they believe that, there's no Earth to worry about tomorrow. Outside, the rail platform activated. The warhead rolled into launch position, tip pointed skyward beneath the braking shield. This would be the last time Earth fired first. Commander Ryland Holt braced his forearm against the cockpit side brace, watching the Vren fleet shift above Earth's upper atmosphere. The destroyers had realigned again, now forming a shallow crescent with gaps that weren't there before. Signs they were scanning slower, reacting slower, second-guessing. The illusion was still holding, but the window was closing. Confirm all interceptors in position, he said into the short-range comm. Shadow Wing reporting green, came the reply. All fighters slaved to auto-drift on heat mask, no emissions, waiting your push. He tapped the manual override. Then make them believe we're charging. 12 Earth shuttles surged forward with short bursts, not from weapons systems, but from vented ballast and flipped internal coils, giving off the kind of radiation signatures typical of armed strike craft. Holt's team cut their own velocity short and rotated outward, intentionally clumsy, mimicking the behavior of heavier ships aligning cannons. From the Vren vantage, it looked like the Ghost Fleet was finally ready to attack. Inside the command deck of the lead Vren cruiser, overlapping returns began to spike. Trajectory mismatches. Unsynchronized movement. Targets that shouldn't exist began behaving independently. Their observers adjusted the scan nodes, trying to recalculate. They didn't realize their coordination delay wasn't lag. It was design. Inside Southfield 0, Davik Noor stood beside the primary trigger relay, sweat dripping down his spine despite the sub-zero air. The power draw fluctuated once, surged past the recommended arc limit, then settled. The quantum core was stable. Torin Vask stared at the screen without blinking. Target locked? Locked on the relay spine they're using to route commands, Davik confirmed. We pulse now, we cut the head off, then kill the nerve. Torin pressed the panel. The amplifier fired. There was no sound. No light burst. But above the planet, every Vren ship caught mid-section seemed to twitch. One destroyer rotated against its own formation, thrusters suddenly overcompensating. Another began banking too sharply and drifted wide, clipping a patrol cruiser along the edge. The cruiser spun, reacting to a maneuver that hadn't been issued, its weapon batteries lighting up against nothing. Onboard translation banks began to fail. Vren operatives screamed across channels that no longer aligned. Orders arrived out of sequence, some too early, some too late. Coordination had collapsed. Holt's fighter cut through the debris field left by two drones that collided mid-drift. He locked eyes on the flagship's dorsal structure, a long ridge of sensors designed to maintain network authority. It wasn't emitting, it wasn't moving. They're not talking to each other anymore, he said. Still holding fire, his wingman muttered. They haven't declared fallback or retaliation. I think they're waiting for command input. There is no command. Holt banked left, aligning his squad around the rear structure of the nearest battlecruiser. Feed this to Helix, tell them the signal worked, then clear the path. Mailer 10 stood before the fire authorization panel, fingers hovering above the embedded launch console. Confirmation? He asked. Torin's voice came through steady and cold. They're blind. Launch now or don't launch at all. Malor's hand fell flat. Above Earth, 400 orbital platforms powered on for the first time since the Sol Directorate was formed. No announcements. No beacon lighting. Only system-wide lockstep. Coil rails fired. Each slug left a glowing trench of compressed vapor before crossing space in a heartbeat. Seconds later, the fusion payloads followed. Detonations igniting without sound. Only radiation flares sharp enough to burn satellite lenses offline. Vren ships disintegrated not from impact alone but from confusion. Some drifted into the blasts they didn't dodge. Others turned broadside during maneuver errors and exposed vulnerable hull gaps. The flagship held longest, its forward sections absorbing 3 direct impacts before its dorsal housing ruptured, releasing an internal wave of decompression that scattered armor plating into orbit. No escape pods launched. Holt's cockpit rocked as another destroyer broke apart ahead of him. He looped underneath the crumbling wreckage, then dove toward a secondary target cluster where a smaller cruiser struggled to realign. Its engine vector was reversed. It had tried to flee without recalibrating course, and spun off center, tumbling into a dead satellite ring. Still no jump signatures, his wingmen reported. They're not retreating. Because they're not receiving orders, Holt replied, and they don't know how to improvise. He pulled hard left, flipping under the debris trail of the last patrol vessel. His ship rattled from the residual wake of an explosion nearby. But he didn't slow down. Burn what's left. Nothing gets out. Inside Southfield, Davik slumped against the bulkhead, lungs pulling in air like he'd just surfaced from drowning. The core array still vibrated, discharging residual heat through emergency vents. Condensation gathered on the walls. No alarm sounded. Torin remained upright, silent, his eyes still on the scope. You just erased a command species, Davik whispered. Torin blinked slowly. No, they erased themselves. I just gave them a mirror. Above Earth, the final Vren cruiser lost altitude as its navigational stabilizers failed. It clipped atmosphere and began to burn on entry. The heat tore at its outer plating, pieces flaking off like dry scales, until nothing remained but a glowing streak over the Pacific Ocean. Civilians in shelter watched the streak from embedded cameras. No one knew what it was. No one was told. Holt's wing regrouped in silence. 8 returned, 2 did not. He watched the empty space where the flagship used to be. They watched us, they measured us, they called us resource. His hand trembled once as he steadied the control stick. Now they don't call us anything at all. The field above Earth cleared. The ghosts were gone, and so were their gods. Burning fragments streaked across the upper sky in silence. From Earth's surface, they looked like meteor showers. Brilliant arcs sweeping over the Pacific and fading into smoke behind them. To the unaware, they meant nothing. To the few who knew, each fading trail marked a kill. Shards of warships, slivers of hull, pieces of a command structure that no longer had a pulse. Inside the Directorate's observation tower on Luna, Torin Vask stood behind triple-pane glass reinforced against radiation. The scorched remains of Vren wreckage passed beneath the orbiting station at irregular intervals. Some rotated slowly, trailing vapor trails as their internal coolant systems bled into nothing. Most were already descending, caught by Earth's pull, breaking apart over oceans and uninhabited land. Maylor Tin entered behind him, coat damp from the pressurized walkway. His boots scuffed the tiles as he stepped beside the window. "How many?" he asked without greeting. 17 intact fragments, 2 classified as critical debris, the rest are gone, Torin answered. "No survivors?" "None retrieved, none signaled." Maylor let out a breath, then leaned his knuckles against the edge of the window ledge. "Have we locked down the satellite feed relays?" Torin nodded. "All orbital feeds were rerouted 30 seconds after the final platform fired. Civilian observatories caught early movement, but we've jammed the global uplinks, every image flagged and deleted." "And the media channels?" "Sanitized. We've scrubbed the global net. What remains is noise. Weather anomalies, power fluctuations, scrambled footage. We let them keep what doesn't fit." Maylor stared at the smog ribbon forming in the upper atmosphere from the last cruiser's entry. "They'll ask questions eventually. They always do. And they'll believe whatever answer frightens them less." In the Helix subchamber, Commander Ryland Holt sat alone, hands resting on the console that once held his squadron's flight records. The screen blinked twice, then faded. His entire sortie log had been archived under a classified clearance level that no longer existed. "Pilot logs decommissioned," read the header. He stared at the line for a long moment, then pulled off his gloves and dropped them to the floor. The cold from the deck seeped through his boots. He hadn't spoken since the last wreck burned above the Indian Ocean. His wingmen, those still alive, were reassigned to surveillance duties. No questions, no debrief. Just silence, delivered in official briefings and unspoken nods. A door opened behind him. Torin stepped in. "They pulled the entire engagement from record?" Holt didn't turn. "It didn't happen, right?" Torin leaned against the wall. "They think silence is safer than truth. No monuments, no funerals. Not for ghosts that never flew." Holt finally looked up. His voice was low. "I watched the flagship split in half and waited for pods to launch. Nothing did. They don't run, they expect obedience to carry them. Then they died the way they lived." Torin crossed to the console, tapped a command string, and opened a blank interface. "You want the real record to survive? They buried it. Then rebuild it somewhere they can't reach." Holt didn't reply, but he didn't close the window either. Davik Noor pushed open the airlock at South Field's outer bay, dragging a wheeled containment case behind him. The components rattled inside with every step. Frost had already returned to the panel locks after the last discharge. The bunker would be decommissioned within the week. He knelt beside the storage vault, removed a sealed sheet of polygraphite, and began sketching across it with a magnetic stylus. The lines weren't symmetrical. The design was not built for balance. It was built for silence. Torin joined him, holding a wrapped bundle of tightly wound conductor coils and a pair of detached node cores from the pulse device. "You still think we need sentinels? They found us once. They will again. We can't rely on luck or illusion twice." "You're building them cold," Torin noted, watching him align the relay frame. No signal, no power bleed, just listening towers buried in the belt, passive, unmoving, no transmissions, only if tripped, otherwise they report nothing. Torin placed the coils beside him. And when they do trip? Davik didn't look up. Then we don't discuss it in a bunker. We act. On the surface, cities returned to standard grid cycles. Emergency shelters reopened, rumors circulated about radiation storms, solar interference, cloaking tests. None confirmed, none denied. The Directorate distributed a controlled press release. Orbital grid maintenance had caused fluctuations. Remote satellites were being recalled. Civilian feeds were under recalibration. The public bought it. Most of them. Some knew better. But no one could prove anything. Inside the deepest chamber of Earth's central archive, Maelor Tin keyed in the last entry of the operation. He stood beside a vault containing the only intact Vren drive core recovered from the wreckage. Still inert, still silent. He sealed the record with biometric lockouts and stepped back. "We won't make this mistake again," he said aloud, though no one else was there. He stared at the vault's reinforced wall, then turned and walked out. The lights dimmed behind him. In lunar orbit, 2 technicians finished disassembling the final remains of a downed Vren fragment. The outer hull cracked as it touched atmospheric transition, spilling burned circuitry into vacuum. No beacon ignited. No signal left the system. The memory of the invasion ended with ash. And the galaxy never knew what Earth had done. The new cloaking grid didn't hum. It didn't glow. It didn't even buzz when a power surge passed through the anchoring nodes. It was designed to vanish even from Earth itself. Buried beneath ice shelves, mountain ranges, and low-orbit scatter fields, the adaptive mesh read every incoming signal, every frequency pulse, every particle shift, and swallowed them without response. It didn't deflect, it absorbed, and it never asked permission to act. Torin Vask stood at the helm of its command center, an unmarked installation beneath the South Pacific seabed. The air was dry and cool. The only noise came from the internal ventilation as it rerouted flow across the walls where seawater pressed with slow, crushing weight. His new title, Chief of Quantum Sentinel Integration, hadn't changed the way he carried himself. Still minimal, still unreadable, but now no one questioned him when he rewrote protocols. Across the room, a technician ran the final diagnostics on the orbital web. Grid sync complete. No fluctuation detected in last 4 hours. The cloak is now adaptive at all 6 layers. Torin nodded. "Keep it drifting, never let it settle on one pattern." "We've randomized the core template," the technician replied. "It changes phase cycle every 90 seconds. "Good, let them scan until they give up." He walked toward the secured comms wing, not to make contact, to review silence. Earth's new doctrine required 0 broadcast leadership, no transmissions unless the planet was under immediate existential threat. Instead of command alerts, the Directorate now passed directives through ground-tethered pulses, masked as seismic anomalies. Quiet had become the first layer of defense. Rylan Holt leaned against the railing inside the Stratcom dome above what used to be Earth's old orbital academy. Now it served a different purpose. The new operatives wore no insignias. Their ships carried no transponders. Their logs would never reach any historical archive. "You're not soldiers," he said to the row of recruits seated before him. "Soldiers look for battles. You look for silence. You don't fly to be seen. You disappear to be remembered. By no one." They didn't react. That was good. He paced in front of them, holding the control stick of a decommissioned fighter in one hand. "You'll learn how to fly without running signals. You'll train to drop below thermal detection. You'll navigate by gravitational drift. You will never broadcast." He tossed the control stick to the floor. It clattered, bounced once, and settled. "You don't steer anymore. You drift. You don't attack, you vanish. And if the time ever comes to strike, he leaned forward, voice steady but grave, you'll do it in a way they can't explain. He stepped back and left the room. They didn't stand. That was better. In the Andes fusion arrays, Davik pulled his gloves off, revealing hands calloused from weeks of wrench work. He stepped back from the exposed circuit bay of the newest off-grid power core. His design didn't require a central regulator. Each node worked independently, mirroring what the Vren had once used to anchor their fleet. The irony wasn't lost on him. What's the latency? He asked without looking up. Substation 3 report 0 delay, load distributions holding. He wiped his forehead. Then we've got autonomous supply to 43 cities. Nothing external, no grid lines, no emissions. Civilian networks? The engineer beside him asked. Davik shook his head. No broadcast, not even for diagnostics. We've wired it like the cloak. If it breaks, it dies quiet. He climbed down the scaffold and looked at the towers behind him. Each a silent monolith, painted to blend into the rock behind it, disguised as nothing of consequence. We don't build loud, he muttered. We build real. At the Directorate's Internal Leadership Summit, fewer chairs were filled than before. The new generation didn't wear medals. They reviewed security briefings inside insulated domes built beneath ocean shelves and mountain cores. Maylor Tin stood at the head of the chamber. From this moment, Earth's silence is not a retreat. It's the mask we wear to survive. No one clapped. They never did in these meetings. He continued, we do not announce. We do not warn. We do not explain. He looked to the side where Torin stood. The last war didn't bring recognition. It brought clarity. They built gods in fire. We built shadows in thought. He stepped back and signaled the council into motion. The protocol remains unchanged. No contact, no transmission. We are a myth until we must be something else. In lunar orbit, the observatory rotated gently, its hull layered in black thermal shielding to prevent reflection. No human had stepped aboard it for 5 days. Only one entered now. Torin Vask stepped into the viewing chamber, the door hissing shut behind him. He approached the main viewport, staring across the belt of stars that had once felt distant, now familiar enough to study, dangerous enough to fear. The console beside him displayed only light signals. Dozens. Hundreds? Some were merchant routes. Others could be science vessels. A few blinked in patterns too complex to decode. He stood there for hours. He didn't take notes. He didn't speak. Eventually, the lights shifted again. And in that moment, he understood something the others had forgotten. Fire was seen. Thought was not. He pressed one key, saving the trajectory of a new blink pattern far outside known travel corridors. The entry disappeared. He turned toward the empty deck behind him and spoke aloud, though no one would hear. They'll look for empires. They'll miss the ones who never needed to rise. He stepped away from the viewport, eyes heavy, pace steady. Let them write legends of fire. We wrote our chapter in silence, and no one will ever read it. What would you do? Strike back in fire, or hide in silence and win without ever being seen? Comment your thoughts below, and if this story gave you chills, hit like and subscribe for more cold, calculated victories of Earth.